this air to go down Saga, go under, Nakama, go on Nakama.
I said hallelujah to the 16th oil bins. You're getting down on your motherfucking knees, and it's time for your sickness again. Come on and tell me what you need now. Tell me what is making you bleed. We got 2 more minutes and we're gonna cut to what you need. So on the 6, tell me, long do you want to live? And on the 7, tell me, is it time for your motherfucking hands to give? And tell me, is it time to get down on your motherfucking knees? Tell me, is it time to get down, 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 down?
I'm blown to the maxim, 2 hemispheres, battling. I'm blown to the maxim, 2 hemispheres, battling. Shut up. One last breath. Take a drag. Off a death.
How you doing out there, Austin, Texas? I don't know where I'm at, but I know I'm right here, and this is Jeff Contreras, and you are watching There4Iam. As always, we are the philosophical show with the political edge, and we have what is beginning to become a tradition around here at There4Iam. Part 1 of a series of shows entitled Jesus Christ, the Son of God, and we'll actually be doing this all throughout the month of December, because December, of course, is Christmas time of the year. The holidays have started. They start sooner every year. This year they started, you know, right before Halloween. Here we are, though, and now December, though, and if you're not too burnt out on Christmas carols yet, you don't have too much further to go till Christmas. But that being said, and with Christmas on the mind of so many people, that usually brings to mind Jesus as well. And so I thought, well, what a better chance, you know, what a better opportunity to do shows on Jesus when at least some people, or at least more people than not, are in that frame of mind, or at least have Jesus somewhere on the back burner. So regardless, either way where you stand, either whether you're for Jesus or against him, you probably have an opinion one way or the other. And you might be thinking to yourself, well, you know what, Jeff, there's probably too much talk about Jesus already as it is. Why don't you go put your show on Channel 11 or something like that? Well, for those people who are thinking that right now, you're going to like this show tonight for content, that's for sure. All I can say is just hang in there. Not only are you going to like this show, but you're going to like the next 3 shows because it's a 4-show set. For those of you who think that there's too little Jesus talk on the air, well, I tell you what, you got 4 full weeks of it coming at you. You just might not like the content. But regardless, and the reason why I'm saying you probably won't like the content is because what I intend to propose, not only tonight, but for the next 4 nights, is that Jesus Christ, the Savior, the figurehead of one of the largest religions in all of the world, Christianity, that was in actuality not a real person but was a myth, and he never was truly a man of the flesh. That's what I'm proposing, okay? And there's 2 main reasons why I'm actually proposing this. The very first reason, and the most important reason by far, is to make you think. Whether this is true or not, the purpose of not only this show, but the shows all throughout December is to make you think. What I'm going to do is offer up to you a different perspective. And what I'm asking is that you'll just soak it in, accept it, and think about it, and then either reject it or integrate it into your system. But don't just tune me out right now. Give it some thought, mull over it a little bit, because whether you're a Christian or not, these shows are going to give you a different perspective. And what we want to do here is examine some of the most fundamental belief structures that people have. Attacking your fundamental belief systems, you know, when you do that, it's going to bring about some pain, a little bit of discomfort. And because of that, you might be tempted to change the channel. But I'm asking you just to hang in there, bear with me, not only tonight, but for the rest of the month, and just listen to what I have to say, what I propose to you, and then make up your mind sometime later on in the week after you've given the show's content a little bit of thought. These shows, perhaps, in the following month will have the power to either destroy your faith, but if that happens, I say to you that your faith was misplaced to begin with. This show perhaps could strengthen your resolve in your faith. And if so, well, hey, more power to you. This shows could do neither, or they could do both. But either way, my intention is not to do any of that at all. It's only to make you think. Remember, that's the first and main reason I'm doing this. The second reason is because, honestly, I strongly feel that organized religions in general are not concerned with their followers' spiritual growth, only their spiritual obedience. I don't really think they are concerned or are really trying to make or uplift and enlighten the whole world. And that should be the purpose and goal of any type of religion. No, they just want you to believe what they tell you to believe, and everything will be hunky-dory as long as you follow what they say. Unfortunately, most religions have degenerated into these types of psychological prisons, a term coined by a wonderful author by the name of David Icke. And these prisons neither encourage growth nor harmony between its followers or the rest of the world in general. And don't think that I'm just trying to front out Christianity, and if you're Islam, that Islam is the one true religion, or Judaism, or Hinduism, or anything like that, because in actuality, you can break down a religion like I'm about to break down Christianity in the next 4 months. Anyone can do it. All you have to do is put in the time. And one of the only reasons I'm picking on Christianity is because I was raised a Christian, raised Catholic all of my life. I've had all my sacraments except for marriage and death. And although the Catholic Church would probably shun me, they would probably excommunicate me from the church perhaps, you know, I think I've pretty much followed the tenets that they've put forward. It's also, I want to make this clear, it's not my intention to get you to abandon religion in any way, shape, or form. As watered down as I think religions, and really I mean organized religions, as watered down as I think they've become, I believe, honestly, that every single major religion has within it the keys to spiritual growth and enlightenment. But, unfortunately, they've been obfuscated. You can't really find them very easily. You have to search. You have to do some research. You have to check around. You have to give it some thought. And that's hopefully what we're going to be doing in the next 4 weeks. We're going to be giving Christianity and its origins some serious thought in order to perhaps reintegrate some different beliefs into this fundamental belief system, Christianity. You know, I do believe a lot of things, honestly. I believe for sure that the truth is where you find it. I believe, without a doubt, that there is an energy out there that you or me or anyone else can tap into that can be compared to all the positive attributes given to Jesus Christ. I believe that this energy itself is enlightening, is uplifting, is very powerful, very connective. Do I believe that Jesus was a flesh and blood man, though? You know, I tell you what, I don't believe it matters. I really don't. So we're going to examine that tonight. And I tell you what, while I'm doing this, this will give you a chance. If you can get online, go to There4Iam.com, and we've got a new question for the month, and you can log in your opinion and find out what's going on. And all you have to do is go to www.There4Iam.com and go to the second page, and the question is right there. It's very easy. All you have to do is pick what you think it was, and actually they'll probably show you how to do this in just a second. And while they're doing that, I'm going to go ahead and talk about the story here, talking about the history of Jesus Christ himself. Because since we're going to be exploring Christianity, I want you to know, I mean, let's face it, you cannot go far in Christianity at all without focusing on its founder, Jesus Christ. He is at the heart, the root of that whole religious system. And for all the things throughout the centuries that have been written and said about Jesus, he left no writings whatsoever. None. Not one piece of writing that bears his name or signature. Think about that for a second. This person was God. He was the Son of God, or God, and he came as his own son, and he didn't write anything, although he taught everyone he came into contact with, supposedly. Even though he didn't leave any writings at all, this Jesus figure, Jesus Christ, has been said to be all things to all people. He's all things to all people, but he never left one piece of writing. How do you think he got so popular, and why? Is it because he was divine? Let's give it some thought. You know, let's examine a little bit of the evidence. Jesus Christ came along at a time during civilization, during humanity, when there was a lot of people wandering about claiming to be a Messiah, a chosen one, an anointed one, a son of God, a savior, someone who could help you. These people were all over the place. As a matter of fact, they used to wander in from the east, usually India, and come into the area that is currently inhabited by the Jews at the time. Jesus has been compared as being a teacher of morality. He's also been described as a revolutionary. Back in about 150 years ago, when Theosophy was making a big rage again, it was really fashionable to put Jesus, his missing years, because, you know, hardly anything is written about Jesus. And so a lot of people wanted to put Jesus in India and say, oh, well, this is where Jesus got all of the basis of his teachings, from India. And there's lots of speculation and theory about his missing years, and we probably won't even need to touch on any of that at all in order to help shed some light on whether he was flesh or not. Lately, in the past 20, 30 years or so, probably maybe even 40 years, with the advent of the New Age, it's been very popular to portray Jesus as the cosmic Christ, or just Christ consciousness in general, not to mention being the times in the 70s, with flower power and all that, the hippie movement, Jesus was associated with the magic mushroom even. So Jesus is always associated basically with everything, and a lot of people attributed that to his divineness, saying, well, because Jesus was divine, he can relate to all different types of people. But I really think it's mostly because since nothing was really known about Jesus, you can say that Jesus was this or Jesus was that, and nobody can really refute it because nobody actually knows. Because the history of Jesus is scant to nil. And we're going to go into some of that evidence tonight. And then next week we're going to talk into a lot of the other religious myths that were about at the time and how these got molded into what later became Christianity. So with all of the conflicting material that's out there about Jesus, sooner or later it'll become a little bit obvious that you're either dealing with a totally fictitious story, or perhaps, at best, some type of, I don't know, conglomeration of stories. I don't know. We'll try to get into that in just a little bit. But one of the most enduring and compelling controversies in this whole subject, and believe me, I'm not the first person to ever bring this up, and I'm sure it won't be the last. People have, throughout the centuries, have wanted to know whether or not Jesus Christ was a flesh and blood man. It's as simple as that. There's been lots of controversy, and I'll tell you why. Think about this for a second. If the facts of this story are so cut and dry, if it's just so obvious, if all the ducks line up in the row, then why is it that only 1/3 of humanity is Christian? Think about that for a second. If there was no doubt, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that Jesus Christ was the Son of God, then why is it that 1/3, or actually 2/3 of the world are not even Christians, don't even believe that he was the Son of God? There was quite a civilization before Jesus was said to have been around. A lot of people think that there was just nothing going on, but that's just not the case. The Greeks had a thriving civilization hundreds of years, and the Egyptians for thousands of years before Jesus Christ ever came onto the scene. The philosopher Plato lived for 500 years before Jesus. 500 years before Jesus. And no one doubts Plato's existence. Think about that for a second. Jesus, 50-50. Plato, about 98% of the world believes that Plato existed. Why? He lived 500 years before Jesus, but he left a ton of writings. I mean, it's not like there was nothing going on there. People were writing, there was civilization, there was things going on. A lot of these records still exist. There were a large amount of historians alive and around at the time that Jesus lived. What they said about Jesus, we'll go into tonight. So, over the centuries, there have been many people who've given thorough and extensive research, producing volumes and volumes of literature, which demonstrates both logically and intelligently that Jesus Christ is in fact a mythical figure about along the same lines as those of the gods of ancient Egypt, Greece, England, India, Phoenicia, Rome, Samaria, and elsewhere. These researchers, many, and their name is legion before me, have fueled debates on these schools of thought. I mean, hardcore knockdown, drag-out debates. We'll talk about the Council of Nicaea. Actually, you know, I went through a lot of books in order to help research these shows, and we'll be showing you some of the books throughout the show of actually what I researched to go through this. And usually what happens is, if you have any thoughts of Jesus whatsoever, that usually falls into 3 different types of categories, whatever you think about him. And you're either a believer, an everemist, or a mythicist. Okay? And that's the way it is. There's 3 categories, 3 general categories that you can fall in if you believe in Jesus. Now, the first group, the believers, well, they take the Bible as the literal Word of God. I mean, it's really, really that simple. The Bible is the literal Word of God. And if you think about that for a second, that means that a male God actually came down. He came down from the heavens as his own son through the womb of a Jewish virgin, and he worked astonishing miracles. He was killed, resurrected, and ascended into heaven. Then, we're also expected to believe that this omnipotent and perfect God could only, like, he was the only one that could fix a world that he created imperfectly by the act of blood atonement or blood sacrifice. And it was well known to any type of scholars or archaeologists that in those days, blood sacrifice was basically at the heart and root of all of the religious myths. And it's through, they used the blood sacrifice to help tell the stories of the seasons. Then we're also required to assume that in order to get his important message across, that God, Jesus Christ, came down to one of the remotest regions of the world. Think about this. There was hustling and bustling civilizations all over the place, yet he comes down to where he comes, Israel, Palestine, in that area, and he speaks Aramaic, one of the most backward languages at the time. You have millions of people speaking Greek or Rome, yet this God chose to come down in bumfuck, really, and he came in, he spoke Aramaic, which nobody spoke. It's like he would come in, and instead of going to New York, instead of going to Washington, D.C., he came in at Elgin. And nobody could understand him because instead of speaking English, like everyone around here would understand, he would speak, I have no idea, Filipino. So there you go. I mean, it's almost ludicrous to think. But the believers actually will believe this. They take the Bible very literally. And I'm not saying that it's wrong to do that. I'm just saying that it's hard to do. It's very hard to do. I'm not saying it's impossible, but it makes quite a demand of your logical function that I don't think most people are willing to go that far. Then you have the Evermerists, and this group of people actually believe that Jesus Christ was a man who lived in the flesh. He came along and he did some teachings, and then over the centuries, a lot of these fantastic miracles and attributions were placed around Jesus in order to deify him or to make him something more than what he was. But really, if you think about it, or if you actually gave it some thought, if Jesus was just a man, just a simple teacher, he never would have gained the notoriety that he did for that time of the year. He never would have drew the attention of Pontius Pilate. He never would have drawn the ire of the Jews there. They never would have called for his death if he was just a simple teacher. Supposedly they did this because he was doing these miracles that these Evermerists think that were added on later throughout the centuries. So that in itself also makes abnormal demands on your logical function. And then you have the mythicists. And I have a lot of sympathy for the mythicists because I fell into that category for the longest time after when I was younger and I was wrestling with the Jesus issue myself, and I was trying to think to myself, well, there's so many things here that don't make sense. How can I rectify this in my own mind? And the way I did it was to think, well, you know what? This must be some incredibly sublime allegory that talks about a mythical journey, and this must be completely spiritual, in the astral, totally discarnate. And that in itself helped me understand, or at least make sense of this whole Jesus story. And there are certain things about that, though, that I never realized at the time until I started re-examining this whole structure of Christianity and its origins. that just don't seem to make sense, and we'll touch on those as well. For those, actually, that have been able to accept the historical nature of Jesus Christ, because not only is there no proof of his physical existence at all, but actually, on the contrary, there's plenty of evidence, but it all seems to indicate that Jesus was a mythological character. In fact, this belief flourished in the very first 200 years immediately after the supposed death of Christ, and in the last 200 years as well. As a matter of fact, more and more people have begun to research this, and a lot of evidence has been found from the very first couple of centuries which show that the very first Christians did not even believe in a historical Christ. And if we could show some of the books that I've used to research this, I would really appreciate that. Let's see here. Some of the very first and early Christians, some of the Gnostics, let's see. These people actually denied the humanity of Christ, but they were themselves Christians. And not only of the first order in time, because they were actually around in the first century after Christ's supposed death. But these people would actually deny the humanity of Christ, and they left several written works behind. Let's see here. Gerald Massey, who has written lots of books on the subject, put it like this. It says here, it can be demonstrated that Christianity pre-existed without the personal Christ. It existed for hundreds of years before Christ actually came along, and then it was continued by Christians who entirely rejected the historical character of Christ in the 2nd century. But over the decades, these Christians were edged and pushed out of positions of authority, and the carnalizers of Christ gained controlling authority power, and they began to weave this tale, this fictitious tale of Christ, the carnal man. Okay. The early church, folks, was Catholic. And Catholic means universal. That's what the word means. And it's not universal because it's the true religion. It's universal because they took every single religion and they made a hodgepodge. They made a melting pot, and they created one religion which they called Catholicism. The story of Jesus is only presented in the Gospels. Think about that, folks. 4 books of the New Testament tell the only story of Jesus. And not only that, these 4 stories contradict themselves a number of times and become actually a mass of impossibilities. It is so difficult to believe that the Gospels themselves are so difficult to believe that the early church fathers had a hard time believing it themselves. This is a quote, folks. This quote is, "I should not believe in the truth of the Gospels unless the authority of the church forced me to do so." Think about that for a second. I should not believe in the truth of the Gospels unless the authority of the Catholic Church forced me to do so. This is a quote from St. Augustine, one of the preeminent early church fathers, and even he could not put any faith in the Gospels. The Gospels are all priestly forgeries. And not only that, they've all come a century after their pretended dates. With the exception of one writer, Papias, an early church father, who speaks of a narrative of Mark and a collection of sayings which Jesus might have given, no Christian writer in the first 150 years of the Common Era ever quotes the Gospels or any sayings of Jesus. So that means in about the first 120 years after Jesus' purported death, not one writer of the time quoted the Gospels. That means that they probably weren't written down, at least in that 120 years. That means they all came around either the late 2nd century or the early 3rd century, hundreds of years after Jesus' purported death. Nearly everything written concerning the Gospels prior to the year 325 AD has been either lost or destroyed. Think about that. There are tons of volumes. You could fill warehouses with the amount of literature from the ancient or the olden days, Jesus' era. Yet, all the writings of the Gospels, hardly nothing, lost or destroyed, up to 325. And then after that, once the whole consolidation of Christianity comes about during the Council of Nicaea, the First Council of Nicaea, that's when Christianity really gains in power and takes over. So, then in 506, the Emperor Anastasius retouched the Gospels. So not only did they not exist until around the 200s, but in the 500s, Anastasius reworks them. And it was known because history, it's in the history. There were no papers at the time, of course, but church records will show. All you have to do is go to the Catholic Encyclopedia, look up Anastasius, and you can see that he retouched the Gospels in 506 AD. Forgery in the early church was so rampant that they coined a term for it. It's called pious fraud. Pious fraud. That's a term given in the Catholic Encyclopedia to describe the forgery that was going on in the first few centuries in the Catholic Church. The Gospels themselves cannot be found before the end of the 2nd century. Only fragments may be pointed out to. And not only that, those fragments are not Christian. They are Gnostic, if anything, perhaps maybe even Egyptian or Hindustan or something much older. And we'll go into that next week. So, what type of proof is actually out there showing that Jesus exists? Well, we'll have to use the Bible first of all. We'll use other sources as well, but we'll start at the Bible. So many people point to the Bible as giving definite proof that Jesus was a flesh and blood man and he actually existed, so that's where we're going to start. So it's important to realize that the story of Jesus in the Bible can only be found there. And these books, which were supposedly didn't show up until at least 200 AD, and also in some of the books are the Gospels and the Epistles, although most of Acts can be found almost thousands of years before in the Egyptian Book of the Dead. Of all the epistles, perhaps the most convincing that Jesus was a flesh and blood man were the epistles of Paul. Now you have to remember, Paul was not one of the original apostles. His name used to be Saul, and then he had a conversion on the road to Damascus. So he never knew Christ or Jesus in the flesh. He had a vision of Jesus on the road to Damascus, and he writes about his vision, and then he goes along to preach of Jesus Christ after this vision, but he never saw Christ in the flesh. These Pauline epistles are a very important part of Christianity, yet none of the Pauline literature mentions Pilate, any of the Romans, Caiaphas, the Sanhedrin, Herod, Judas, the holy women, or any account of the Passion whatsoever. Some of the most important events of Jesus' life were not even mentioned by what would become his most zealous supporter. Doesn't that seem odd to you? The Pauline epistles do not demonstrate a historical Jesus in any way, shape, or form. And the only time Paul mentions Jesus, he does it in a spiritualized form or seeing Jesus as a vision. The Gospels themselves, although many people think that they're the inspired Word of God, remember, they didn't show up until the 2nd century at least. That means a good 100, and the late 2nd century, so 150, 170 perhaps years after Jesus. That means in no way, shape, or form can you really expect them to give accurate accounts of the details in Jesus' life. Can you imagine that? Having something handed down from word of mouth for over 100 years, 150 years, and then you writing it down and expecting the details to be accurate. I don't know. So, despite the claims of apostolistic authorship, the Gospels were originally written in Greek. Think about that for a second. All the apostles were Hebrew, or they were Jews, you know, and they wrote in Aramaic. Yet, all the Gospels were written in Greek. All the other books of the New Testament are written in Aramaic. But the Gospels aren't. They're written in Greek. Why? Not only that, the wording is Greek. It's not Hebrew. It's not Greek written from a Hebrew translation. It's Greek, and then it was translated into Hebrew, or then into Latin. Very, very weird and odd. That's not something that should be. Let's see here. Furthermore, in the Gospels are the only accounts of Jesus' death and resurrection, and all 4 of them differ dramatically with each other. And not only that, not one of the Gospels states how old Jesus was when he died. Think about that. One of the most important figures in the history ever, yet no one records how old he was when he died. And this was such a controversial fact, the early church fathers were constantly bickering about this. Half of the church fathers thought he lived to the age of 50, the other half thought he died when he was 33, and some, even in the weirder sects, thought he never died, that he lived through the crucifixion, that he went on, married Mary Magdalene, and had several children, and even went off to live in either India or France, or some people had him going off to live again in Egypt. In fact, by the end of the 3rd century, there were no fewer than 25 different versions of Jesus' death and resurrection. Some of these, like I said, didn't even have him being put to death at all. So as far as the Bible goes, you cannot use the Bible to prove that Jesus actually existed. So what else can we use? Well, we'll try to use some non-biblical sources. And like I said, there was several writers alive at the time. Surely there must be some evidence, some type of historical documentation that shows that Jesus was around. The Romans must have some type of documentation, something like that, something that you could pull off on some type of official records. But nothing. It's either nil or very, very scant. And actually, it's nothing. Eusebius, he was a very early church father, and he wrote volumes about the Christian church. Let's see here. And he says, with the exception of one passage of the wandermongering Josephus, there's not the slightest words of Jesus at all from any historical writer. And not only that, a lot of previous researchers think that Eusebius himself forged that passage into Josephus because he didn't come around until the 300s, and no other church fathers before him had even mentioned the Josephus work. there was a Roman historian, his name was Livy, and he was alive from 59 before the Common Era to 17 in the Common Era. So he was in basically his adult prime when Jesus hit the scene. This guy composed over 142 volumes of work. Not one word of Jesus or Christians or any of the apostles or anything, and Pliny studied that area extensively. Philo, another Jewish historian, he lived from 20 before Jesus to 50 Common Era. Not one word of Jesus. No mention of all of the Christians or the apostles. Flavius Josephus, the most famous by far of all Jewish historians. And why is he the most famous? Because he purportedly mentions Jesus. We showed his book earlier. It's huge, it's thick, it's voluminous, and the passage that claims, that they point to claim that Jesus was historical is very short, and it gives no detail at all. And I'm not saying it's obviously forged, but because there was no mention of it in the first 300 years of Christianity, when the church fathers were trying desperately to prove that Jesus Christ was a man, if they had this evidence at their disposal, believe you me, they would have used it. Also, who else? Pliny the Younger. He lived from 62 to 113. A lot of Christians say that Pliny talks about Jesus and the Christians. Yet, if you look at Pliny's writings, what he's actually referring to is a group called the Essenes. And that's the way he wrote it in his writings, Essenes. It's never given as Christians once. No mention of Jesus whatsoever. Tacitus. He lived from 55 to 120. Another historian that some Christians say, well, he talked about Jesus. But really, if you look at his writings, and they say that his writings, that the Christians were persecuted under the dictator Nero, there are several volumes of his writings where this passage doesn't even exist, and it's not mentioned until the 6th or 7th century, and many people claim this to be a forgery. Suetonius, who lived from 69 to 140, was a Roman historian who referred to a man named Chrestus. And a lot of Christians will point to that and say, well, here you go. This guy talked about Jesus as well, another historian who talked about Jesus. But in reality, Chrestos has the definition of good or useful and was given to many freed slaves at the time. So, at the time of Christ's alleged advent, there were dozens, if not 100, reliable reporters or historians who weren't biased, who didn't like to color their perspectives with mythology, who weren't out to create some type of God, who weren't filled with cultural bias, who didn't have religious bigotry. Yet, not one of these writers, not one, has given a single testimony to such amazing events as recorded in the Gospels. Miraculous events. Astounding. Yet, I mean, think about this. Don't you think word would have got out? That these historians would have wanted to check it out, to see for themselves, or to at least report it. Say, hey, a weird group of people over here are saying that this guy is going wacky. He's feeding the multitudes, fish coming out of baskets, bread coming from out of nowhere. He's walking on water. He's raising the dead. He's curing lepers. He's doing all kinds of stuff. Yet, no mention by anyone outside of the gospel accounts. So, can we use the Bible? And that's not really reliable to prove that Jesus was a flesh and blood. Can we use other non-biblical sources? Well, in reality, no, because no historian of the time will give you evidence to help prove the fact that Jesus was a flesh and blood. Is there other evidence, though? Well, yeah, there is, because just because there's no evidence proving that Jesus was a flesh doesn't mean there's no evidence. there are tons of writings that exist from a group called the Gnostic Christians, some of the earliest Christians that were around in the very first century, the aughts, if you will, that were saying, hey, what are you wackos doing putting a flesh and blood man into all of our stories and making something out of our religion that it was never meant to be? Tons of these writings abound. So, for example, one of the early church doctors, Augustine, readily confessed that Christianity was a rehash of what had already existed long prior to the Christian era. And I'm going to read a small quote from what he had to say here. That which is known as the Christian religion existed among the ancients. It never did not exist. From the beginning of the human race until the time when Christ came in the flesh, at the time when the true religion, which already existed, began to be called Christianity. Also, from one of the very early church fathers, Justin Martyr, and you might remember his name because it's from him that we get the word martyr, and meaning martyred, because he was, one of the Christians that the Romans took and was fed to the lions or whatever. He was actually a Gnostic Christian, and to quote from him, let's see, I am established in the knowledge and the faith of the Scriptures by those counterfeits which he who is called the devil is said to have performed among the Greeks, just as some were wrought among the Magi in Egypt, and by other false projects in Elijah's days. They tell of the son of Jupiter who was begotten with intercourse of simile, and that he was the discoverer of wine, and then they relate to the being torn in pieces. And when they introduce the wine to the mysteries, I do not perceive that he has intimated the prophecy announced by the patriarch Jacob and recorded by Moses. So what he's trying to say is that there was established long before the supposed time of Christ the roots of what had become the Christian religion. There were other early Christians of the time who were also more blunt in their confessions as to the nature and purpose of this whole new Christian tale. To quote Pope Leo X, what a great prophet that fable of Christ has brought unto us. A very, very telling quote from one of the early popes in the Christian religion. The Gnostics, who I had mentioned earlier, thank you. I'd mentioned the Gnostics briefly earlier, and what a lot of people don't realize is that as much maligned as Gnostics are today by a lot of Christians, it was the Gnostics themselves who were the first Christians, who were the early Christians, and who were actually the Christians that were prosecuted by the Romans, or actually persecuted. One of the largest groups of critics at the time against Christianity in general was the Gnostics. They were opposed to the whole carnalization and the Judaization, actually, of their allegorical text. They had these stories existed in their religious myth for hundreds of years, and then a small group of people came along and put a flesh man around it and started creating a new religion called Christianity. If you read the Bible in the New Testament, you come to a part where it talks about Simon the Magus, and there was a cult of Simon the Magus. Yet, and there's many records that exist that describe this cult. And Simon the Magus, his followers, admittedly believed that he was a myth. Yet Simon the Magus is portrayed as a historical character in the New Testament. Now, if his own believers thought that he was a myth, then how could he be an actual person in the New Testament? Things just don't make sense. Also, many Christian concepts are in fact actually Gnostic, such as the disdain for the flesh and disdain for matter in general. Gnosticism was eventually changed into Orthodox Christianity around 220 of the Common Era. And as time went on, this small faction of carnalizing Christians began to take over and gain positions of power until they made it the official religion of the whole Roman Empire. Also around that time, there was a small sect of Christianity named the Docetism. And the Docets actively went around and tried to tell people that Jesus Christ never lived in the flesh. And these were some of the first Christians persecuted under the newfound power of the Roman authority. Let's see, I'm running out of time here. I could go on and on. Ignatius, one of the bishops of Antioch, Marcion of Pontus. There are many other Gnostics, even pagans such as the time of Celsus. All of these people have left warehouses full of writings that tell of the veracity of the gospel stories and how the historicity of its main characters are nothing but fables, completely made up time after time after time. Oh, my goodness. Let's see here. Only got about 9 minutes left. I guess I can finish. So, the Bible is not reliable to prove that Jesus was a man. Other historic recorders of the time give no evidence to help prove that Jesus was actual flesh and blood man. As a matter of fact, to the contrary, the evidence that does exist suggests that Jesus was a myth who became carnalized, perhaps for political power. So no written evidence seems to indicate that Jesus was ever existed in the flesh and blood. Is there any physical evidence that perhaps might tip the scales into the favor of carnalization? A lot of people actually think there is, but when you start to examine what physical evidence actually exists, you begin to see things actually in a different light. The early church fathers admit to themselves that they don't know what Jesus looks like. Now think about that. I mean, physical appearance. I mean, that's something that simple. You figure, as important a person as Jesus was, and he certainly was important to the apostles, who went out right after his crucifixion and basically started a religion in his name and converted basically the whole known world at the time. Yet, up to the first 300 years of Christianity, all the evidence that exists on the sarcophagi of the Christian fathers show Jesus to be pictured as a small boy. Why is he pictured as a boy if people knew what he looked like as a man during his crucifixion? It seems a little odd. As a matter of fact, the image of Jesus that we traditionally know now, that of the bearded man with long hair in robes, that is actually a stolen image of the Egyptian god Seraphis, who was actually around for at least 1,000 years before the whole Jesus myth came about. As a matter of fact, the Egyptians had a monotheistic religion for a good 1,500, perhaps 2,000 years before Jesus ever hit the scene. So not even knowing what Jesus' physical appearance doesn't give credence to any type of physical evidence showing that he existed. Also, coins. That is one of the best indicators, when you go back in time, up to what is actually going on. Because coins can be minted instantly. And whenever there's a big event going on, usually coins are minted to commemorate that event. Thousands of coins exist from the era of Jesus. Yet, in that first 300 years, no coins at all exist depicting Jesus or any part of the gospel story. Why is that if it was so important? Other major events of that era were commemorized in coin stamps, and they existed and are on display in many museums. Yet no coins of Christ until about the 5th and 6th century. Also, uh, birth caves, tombs, the Sundry site, all these famous locations in the Holy Land. Most people look to Calvary Hill and to Jesus' tombs and these tourist spots as actual proof that Jesus, or at least somebody, must have existed and some drama must have taken place there. But in actuality, it was Constantine's wife, the wife of the Emperor of Rome, who went to these places, who asked about Jesus, where the Last Supper had taken place, where the resurrection was. When she asked around, nobody knew. This is recorded. This is what it says. She asked around and nobody knew. Suddenly one person told her, oh, it happened over here. She proclaimed a cave, and since then, that's been the historical spot. The fact of the matter is, if you go to the east, there are several towns, villages, which claim that they have the burial spot of Jesus. Hundreds of these places exist, in fact. And not only that, what about the Shroud of Turin? A lot of people think, oh, well, the Shroud of Turin, that must be proof that Jesus existed. Folks, that's not even how he was supposedly taken care of after he was crucified. And not only that, in the 1200s, during the 1300s, a number of churches claimed to have this holy shroud. I think it was like 23. Not only that, 14 different churches claimed to have, in the 1200s, the foreskin, the actual foreskin of Jesus. It's all about marketing. It's all about giving people what they want. The Bible as history, folks, it's
corruption. I manipulate to recreate. This air to go down saga. Go under my karma.